welcome to the very first session of the last day of the conference. So my name is Kowalczyk, and I'm going to be the host of today's session. So joining us, there are two Marks. Mark Tyndall will join us virtually, and Mark Oates will join us physically. So first, Mark Tyndall will deliver the lecture at the keynote, Contradictions in the Health Debate Around Vaping, and then we're going to pass it to another Mark who will give response to that, and then we will have a time for Q&A. So I assume that for many of you, Mark Tyndall does not need an introduction, but bear in mind that there are people in here attending GFN conference for the very first time. So let me just briefly introduce Mark to them. So epidemiologist, physician, and public health expert, Dr. Mark Tyndall was an early advocate for harm reduction programs. He was at the forefront of North America's first legally sanctioned supervised injection facility established in Vancouver in 2003. Since then, multiple studies have shown that safer injection sites saves lives, reduce transmissions of disease, and help people access addiction treatment and other medical services. As someone who had led the opening of these facilities, Mark is used to working in areas of public health that generate headlines. And we all know that tobacco harm reduction and vaping is particular to that. So, Mark?
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you can see and hear me. I guess I'm on a big screen somewhere in an auditorium. I'm talking to you from Vancouver, Canada, and it's 1 o'clock in the morning. So it's really my pleasure to present at the conference. I was last in Warsaw in 2007 at the International Harm Reduction Conference when Jerry Stimson was the executive director of the International Harm Reduction Association. So Jerry and I, if nothing else, are persistent. This year's program is full of people who are very articulate and very knowledgeable about tobacco control, nicotine, and harm reduction. The conference features some of the world's leading experts in these areas, and I am really missing out by not being there in person. I do feel some pressure to add something new and provocative to the proceedings. I plan to focus on some of the contradictions in our response to cigarette smoking, the title in the program, but I want to draw on lessons learned from HIV and how the debate around vaping is really based on fear, blame, and stigma. Can I see my slides there? Great. There we go. I wanted just to put up my conflict of interest slides. I'm very committed to promoting safer nicotine delivery technologies for people who are dying because of cigarette smoking. I have a long history in public health, and I've come to understand that making effective policy decisions means that all stakeholders must be at the table, even if you don't like what they're doing. I believe that we must engage with vaping and tobacco industries if we are serious about phasing out cigarettes. I'm happy to lend my expertise and have consulted with the Vaping Industry Trade Association in Canada, the Canadian Vaping Association, and more recently, Rothmans, Benson, and Hedges. I don't represent these organizations, and the views expressed today are totally my own. So I really want to focus a little bit at the beginning of my comments on HIV. I've said many times to people that my involvement as an advocate for vaping and safer nicotine products have been largely accidental. My career has really been about HIV prevention and care. I started medical school in 1982 when cases of a strange new disease were being described among gay men in New York City and San Francisco. And over the next 40 years, I have had a front row seat as the AIDS epidemic ravaged the world, or rather ravaged specific communities. Fear and blame have dominated the response to HIV, and this has caused so much unnecessary suffering and has cost millions of lives. In the 1980s, it was the 4-H's, homosexuals, hemophiliacs, heroin users, and Haitians, Haitians represented poor Black people around the world. I saw the impact of fear, blame, and stigma on these communities firsthand. I provided care to some of the early cases of Kaposi sarcoma and PCP pneumonia among gay men in Canada. They all died, mostly alone. I have worked extensively with people who inject drugs. In Vancouver, we watched as over 30% of all drug users became HIV positive through sharing needles. Because of prohibition, many people existed outside of the medical system, and even if they did seek medical care, were refused treatment. Many died, again, mostly alone. I provided care for young men attending a hemophiliac clinic at McMaster University. All died, mostly alone. And during the early 1990s, I spent 4 years in Kenya working at the largest STD clinic in Africa when people with weight loss and diarrhea were told to go home and not infect other people before they die. They were feared and despised, and so many died, and again, mostly alone. Things are better now. Treatment is widely available, including for people living in poor countries. The blood supply is safe, HIV awareness is high, and people have tools to protect themselves. There has been good progress in the rights of the LGBTQ communities, at least in some countries. Progress has been very much slower for people who inject drugs. Treatment is now easier to access, but I know even in Vancouver, for example, less than half the people who are actively using drugs are taking antiretroviral therapy regularly. It should be noted that this progress has taken 40 years, and some of the gains that have been made are precarious and currently under threat. Now imagine the world's largest preventable health epidemic that kills or seriously maims almost all of its victims, takes at least 10 years off your life, and has an insidious onset that lulls you into complacency before it's too late to turn back. I am not talking about AIDS, I am talking about smoking. Now, we don't usually consider cigarette smoking in the same light as HIV. Obviously, a cigarette is not a virus. But from a purely public health angle, the number of deaths over the past 40 years from smoking has far exceeded the 40 million people who have died of AIDS. In fact, it is estimated that 8 million people died prematurely from smoking on an annual basis. So that would be 320 million smoking-related deaths in the same time period. We think of untreated HIV as a death sentence, and over 90% of infected people will die prematurely. But premature deaths from smoking are also incredibly high, at around 60%. The actual course of illness is not that dissimilar. HIV infection usually occurs without any major symptoms, and the progression is slow and relentless. Compared with smokers, people with untreated HIV may die a bit quicker, but decades of good health are lost in people who smoke cigarettes prior to an early death. Fear and stigma remain high for people with HIV, despite being around for 40 years. But fear and stigma for smokers is also quite high. And speak to anyone who smokes, and they will give you stories of abuse and ridicule from complete strangers. The populations impacted are similar. It is an overgeneralization, but it is the poor, marginalized, and minority groups who are most impacted by HIV and smoking-related diseases. Tobacco control programs have lost sight of the fact that smoking is really an issue of health equity. Effective treatment is by far the biggest breakthrough in HIV and has saved millions of lives. Modern treatment is effective in 95% of cases. Interestingly, that is exactly the same as the estimated effectiveness of vaping for people who smoke, according to Public Health England. A cure for smoking. No need to continue with my talk, and I guess there's really no need to continue with the conference. But wait, the big difference is the uptake of treatment. Through massive efforts and investment, it is estimated that over 80% of people with HIV have access to treatment, compared with less than 1% of people who smoke cigarettes. This lack of access could be described as a type of structural violence. Now, Our approach to all substance use is really described by structural violence. Paul Farmer, a medical anthropologist who I have so much respect for, died in February of this year while working in Rwanda. He often spoke a lot about structural violence and HIV. The definition he used was structural violence is a way of describing social arrangements that put individuals and populations in harm's way. The arrangements are structural because they are embedded in the political and economic organization of our social world. They are violent because they cause injury to people. It is easy to recognize structural violence in the war on drugs. We deny housing, safety, and health because we have created a situation where people are forced to use drugs that are illegal, making them criminals, and basically excluding them from society. Now criminalized, we can waive compassion, empathy, and support because people are doing something illegal. The only option for them is to stop using drugs, but it is often too late. We have justified destroying people's lives because we don't like the drugs that they take. These are pictures from Vancouver, where I work, but these scenes can be found in cities around the world. This is the carnage left by the war on drugs. Now, for smokers, our approach to exclusion is a little more subtle. We are so used to no smoking signs everywhere, we are numb to them. However, they are clearly designed to exclude and shame people. There is really nothing like it in all of public health. What is fascinating is how quickly the signs were updated with no vaping, based on nothing. There is no evidence of any secondhand vape risk, and people can vape nicotine without producing any vapor at all. Someone made a lot of money making all these new signs. We have even created dual smoking vaping areas. It makes absolutely no sense to force people who are trying to quit smoking to congregate with people who are smoking. But structural violence around smoking goes further than the signage. We have created a narrative around smoking restrictions that know no bounds. Much of this is based on an exaggerated campaign of fear around secondhand smoke exposure. Now, I'm not suggesting that we roll back all of the restrictions on where people can smoke cigarettes, but there are unintended consequences. I view these scenes differently now. People crammed into an airport cage, employees huddled outside a building in the cold and rain, and patients standing around the hospitals with IV poles. We can do these things to people because we have become very comfortable with vilifying and shaming smokers. In 2007, the province of British Columbia announced a smoking ban in all hospitals. I was working on a ward of 24 beds that only admitted people who were HIV positive, and most had become infected through injecting drugs. Everyone smoked, and all used the smoking balcony at the end of the hall. I remember that people in my care just started leaving the hospital against medical advice when the new rule was enforced. 15 years later, by far the most common reason for leaving hospital against medical advice is because of the no smoking policy. I have watched as people with endocarditis, spinal abscesses, advanced HIV, and other life-threatening conditions just leave the hospital. I can only imagine how many people avoid hospital care altogether because they will not give up their cigarettes. This policy has directly led to the death of countless people who needed hospital care. This would be the definition of structural violence built into our no smoking policies. This brings me to packaging. Would we put this sort of messaging on boxes of breakfast cereal to discourage childhood obesity, or wine bottles to discourage alcoholism, or car showrooms to discourage reckless driving? Of course not. It would be considered offensive and insensitive. But for cigarettes, anything goes. What are we trying to say with these images? That you are hideously ugly? That you are killing your baby? or that intergenerational smoking is inevitable. These are disturbing images, and I guess that is the point. But how cruel and stigmatizing can you get? And these messages don't even work. There is a campaign to educate Canadians about drug users with the stated goal of reducing stigma. This is another major contraindication, as at the same time, the government actively mounts an aggressive pro-stigma campaign for smokers. This is the latest bright idea, labeling individual cigarettes. Canada is proudly announcing that it will be the first country in the world to do this. By their own estimates, it will have a very limited impact on getting smokers to quit. They know that shaming people doesn't work, but they also know that this is politically popular with the 85% of the population who don't smoke. We understand that it's difficult to quit. We know that people become dependent on nicotine. We have a pretty good idea of how nicotine works. We even know that the majority of current smokers would actually like to quit. So what is this label trying to accomplish? We might as well tell people that they are idiots. We have taken this approach to the prevention of vaping among young people. Only in this case, the anti-vaping crusaders have suspended any sort of reality in their campaigns. It is just pure science fiction. Reprogramming your brain, having aliens crawl under your skin, creating a whole generation of addicts. It is embarrassing for public health organizations that these campaigns actually exist. Unfortunately, this disinformation campaign has worked quite well. This recent study shows what success looks like. Just 10% of people thought that vaping was less harmful than smoking. This is astonishing. 90% of people either don't know or are completely wrong. In fact, 30% are really wrong and thought that vaping was more risky than smoking. It would be like 30% of people thinking that eating a dozen donuts was healthier than eating a plate of vegetables, or that jumping out of a third-story window was safer than taking the stairs, or that getting a COVID vaccine was more likely to kill you than getting COVID. Okay, so that did happen, but the other extremes are obvious. But anyways, the point is that a massive campaign has been orchestrated to deceive the public, including people who smoke. With this disinformation, it is amazing that anyone has switched to vaping. I hear all the time from my medical colleagues that if vaping is such a good way to quit smoking, then why don't more people do it? Well, because you have been lying to them, that's why. It's the people that don't listen to you that are successful. And you can't make this stuff up. This disinformation campaign is global. On May 31st this year, on World No Tobacco Day, the WHO did not even mention vaping or other safer nicotine products in their press release. Did not even mention it. It's stunning. India received a medal from the WHO for banning e-cigarettes. Mexico just banned e-cigarettes, banned them outright. Along comes an intervention that allows people to enjoy nicotine but won't kill them, and countries ban it. Calling this a contradiction is inadequate. It is insanity. This is a very popular graphic, but it deserves repeat showing. Prohibition doesn't prevent drug use and sets in motion a horrible cycle of health and social misery. Mexico, of all places, should definitely know that. Has the president not watched Narcos on Netflix? There was a whole season just on Mexico. Prohibition is a very bad idea. I'm sure that cartels are already manufacturing e-liquids and defective vaping devices. What an opportunity. Compared with the relatively limited customer base for cocaine and heroin, the potential for illegal nicotine seems infinite. There's another contradiction for vaping and safer nicotine products, and that is the tobacco industry. Really more like a tragic irony than a contradiction. We have a technology that is a major threat to traditional cigarettes, and governments and public health organizations are actively trying to prevent it from happening. The tobacco industry has a long history of deception and denial and continues to make massive profits despite the devastating health and social impacts of cigarettes they produce. The global promotion of cigarettes has led to the continued growth of cigarette consumption. Many countries lag behind the necessary marketing restrictions laid out by the WHO and other tobacco control organizations. Despite this history, the relationship with tobacco companies must be reconsidered with the introduction of safer nicotine products. It is now counterproductive to isolate tobacco and vaping companies from tobacco control conversations when they are changing their business models to promote innovation and safer nicotine products. Most of the major companies have invested heavily in new technologies and are pursuing strategies that will phase out combustible tobacco production. Without their collaboration, the transition away from combustible tobacco will be much slower or may not happen at all. There are many examples where companies who produce dangerous products are seen as part of the solution. We know that oil and gas companies must change their business model in order to reduce global warming, and governments are eager to support their transition to less carbon-intensive production. Car manufacturers that contribute to air pollution and climate change are being incentivized to manufacture electric cars. Forestry companies who are destroying critical forest habitats are being incentivized to pursue sustainable forestry practices. These transformations would never happen if we simply stopped talking to the companies who are causing the harm. In the bigger picture, we should be working with poppy producers in Afghanistan and coca farmers in Colombia to develop a regulated legal market for heroin and cocaine. But that's for another talk. I want to touch on human rights and nicotine as another contradiction. I know that this is a theme at the conference, and there is a panel discussion following this talk. We are fighting for people who don't have a voice, for those who are dying from cigarette smoking. Now, it is complicated because these are people who like smoking cigarettes, and we don't feel overly compelled to fight for their rights to smoke. Many smokers have long ago decided that it is worth it. Like other people who use drugs, they will do this until there is something better. Maybe not healthier, not slicker, not even cheaper. They will switch when there is something actually better. Before vaping and safer nicotine products, it was unlikely that they would find something better. Now they can. There's a great scene from the 1996 movie Trainspotting where Ewan McGregor sings "Choose Life." Choose life, choose a job, choose a career, choose a family, choose a fucking big television, choose washing machines, cars, compact disc players, and electrical tin openers, choose good health, low cholesterol, and he goes on. Then he says, I chose not to choose life. I chose something else. And the reasons? There are no reasons. Who needs reasons when you have heroin? The point being that people do have a choice, and they may choose not to conform with your ideas of a good life. Ultimately, smokers have a choice. It is their right. In every aspect of public health, empathy, support, and connection works far better than shame, punishment, and isolation. This Support Don't Punish campaign was launched in Canada to advocate for harm reduction. I have seen this approach work throughout my career. The basic idea of harm reduction is not laying the blame on the person who is suffering. People with drug dependency need empowerment, need to build self-worth, need to be supported. They already feel defeated and worthless. Why would we ridicule, shame, and punish people who are struggling? I have seen people recover from their addiction. I have seen people reduce and eliminate their drug use, but it was never because they got to a point where they were shamed out of it. Shame makes people use more. So where do we go from here? I've created an advocacy ladder, still a work in progress, but it captures my journey from a researcher, medical expert, to a translational researcher, to an advocate, to an activist, and sometimes I get very close to the top rung of this ladder. I do recognize that it takes people on all the rungs of the ladder to make change, and not everyone needs to climb up a level. But I can tell you one thing, the higher you go, the more fun you can have. Thank you very much.
I would like to say a few words from myself. So as someone who does not work in tobacco harm reduction, the things that I have heard over the past days about the level of division and polarization and violence experienced by some working in this field has shocked me and frankly speaking quite scared. But I'm qualified crisis interventionist and psychologist, and I spent much of my career working in this area with people living with obesity, and I've never heard a person saying that yes, being stigmatized actually helped me to deal with my problem. So yeah, but Mark, so now for our first reaction, we're gonna go to you, please.
Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on that point about stigma, because it's so pervasive across society, and particularly around public health and the work I do in public policy. I've lost, when I was in Parliament working there, if a load of puppies came along from the Royal Society for the Blind, every MP and his researcher would be there. But if anyone wanted to discuss the biggest killer in the constituencies of these MPs, they had very little to no interest. But it's also something that is pervasive, this stigma, for smokers themselves. A lot of them are very embarrassed about being a smoker, and that leads on to people who choose reduced-risk products. Like myself, I'm proud to say that I enjoy nicotine, and I've got no plans to stop using nicotine. I use it in a very safe way, and quite frankly, there's other activities I do, such as in the winter throwing myself off mountains, which probably carries a far greater risk. But no government's telling me not to do that, and there's no regulation really around it. I got to be honest, I don't think I was really fully aware how much stigma there was until last September. I was doing what Mark Tyndall would call, I think, being a shit disturber. I was on the south bank of the River Thames, and me and some vaping mates had managed to beg, borrow, and steal a van, a generator, and a huge projector with size of the Hadron Collider, and we were projecting onto Parliament, right by Big Ben, an image of Boris Johnson vaping, calling on him to back vaping at COP9. Now, it caused a bit of trouble because some media outlets actually started reporting that Boris Johnson is a vapor. I can't confirm whether he is or not. We actually photoshopped the image. Shows how good the media are at catching up on misinformation. But I can tell you that Boris Johnson likes to party, so maybe he's vaping at those. But I obviously invited some journalists and media to come, and one solitary photographer came, and I did my best. I told them about the campaign. I said, this century, 1 billion people are going to die from smoking. It's the biggest cause of preventable deaths. That if you combine the number of people that die from hepatitis, from malaria, HIV/AIDS, it's less than will die from smoking. I did you proud. I thought no one can argue with that. But his response was, that's different. They did it to themselves. it's their fault. And maybe I was naive before, but I was pretty shocked. And at the time, I was watching a TV program, which I'd implore you all to see, called It's a Sin, a Channel 4 program about the HIV epidemic in the 1980s. And I obviously wasn't around that time. So it follows a story of young men in London who are doing what all young men and women will do, which is chase pleasure, which humans are designed to do, just as when I throw myself off a mountain. And obviously, the result is, sadly, because of poor information, because of stigma, one by one, they get ill, fall away, and pass away. And I think, ultimately, we're in the same situation when it comes to tobacco. And luckily, we've moved on from that situation. But I think we need to change minds and hearts if we're going to have any hope of reducing the number of deaths worldwide from smoking. And I think a really stark example of how this affects our public policy is international development. Britain is one of the biggest spenders per capita on international development, quite rightly. And we spend money on reducing deaths from malaria, HIV/AIDS, malnourishment. But we don't, as far as I can tell, spend a penny on trying to reduce deaths from smoking. And the truth is, the only reason for that is because they see those deaths as lesser. And I can imagine the headlines from the Daily Mail if, we started spending money on harm reduction. But sometimes a good leadership means doing the right thing, even if at first people don't understand that it's the right thing to do. These contradictions go elsewhere as well. Around the time I put the projection of Boris Johnson up on Parliament, an MP asked the government in Britain whether at COP9 they would take a harm reduction approach and support harm reduction at COP9. The government's response was that they wouldn't take a harm reduction approach, but that they would tell COP9 delegates about the role vaping has played in reducing smoking rates, which to me says that the government understands that vaping reduces smoking rates, but it doesn't understand why vaping reduces smoking rates, which is the philosophy of harm reduction. And this has an important impact because not only if Britain doesn't take a harm reduction approach to tobacco, will we be unable to ourselves to reach smoke-free 2030, because we won't be using the opportunity that snus offers, we won't be using the opportunity that nicotine pouches offer, we won't be using the opportunity that heat-not-burn offer, but also it's going to have a real long-term damaging effect on the very countries in the lower middle-income countries, because we know that vaping is more expensive than cigarettes in these countries. Britain has been successful because, partly at least, the price elasticity of demand means that people are going to be willing to choose vaping, which is cheaper than smoking. But that doesn't exist in a lot of developing countries. So we need snus and we need nicotine pouches, both to play a role in reducing the billion people that will die by 2100. And I'm afraid that there's failings there in Britain, and there's a huge failing in Sweden, which has been sitting on an absolute gold mine, the ability to reduce deaths worldwide. And weirdly, they have this attitude of, well, we managed to reduce our smoking rate, but don't do what we did. And finally, we have another contradiction, which I just want to come on to, which is around snus, which in many ways is my first love. I switched onto Swedish snus when I was flying home from China after smoking 50 pence a pack cigarettes, and picked up some snus and thought, this is absolutely marvelous. But the British government was complicit in keeping me smoking because I couldn't get hold of snus in the UK. So I'd flipped from getting hold of snus on the illegal market and then smoking, then back to snus, then smoking for 5 years, until eventually I got over my fears of switching one addiction for another and I started vaping. I was very young. But the British government now have said in parliamentary questions that they recognise that snus is far safer than smoking. Yet they do not want to legalise another tobacco product onto the market. And that for me is, I want to take the government to court for that. You're denying an opportunity for people to vastly reduce their harm. And it's baffling. And I just want to, I don't know if Deborah Arnott's watching from ASH, but she says the reason why Britain shouldn't legalise snus is because we have nicotine pouches already. And I can tell you as a snus user, nicotine pouches and snus, they're both fantastic, but the way the nicotine goes into the body is slightly different. And there's another thing that's really important, which is called choice. And the beauty of harm reduction is you leave it to the consumer to choose. And I've been doing some studies of some of my members, and we talk about hierarchy. And some people put snus as number 1 on the hierarchy, and then number 2 is smoking, and number 3 is nicotine pouches. So if you remove the top of the hierarchy, you're left with number 1 being smoking. So I'm very supportive of nicotine pouches. They can do a great job, but just because they're both put into the mouth in the same manner doesn't mean they're the same product. And we need a smorgasbord of options if we're going to achieve what we're all here aiming for, which is to vastly reduce the biggest killer on this earth.
Thanks. So, Mark, the other Mark, yeah? Would you like to comment on this?
Sure. I mean, the stigma part of things is what I was trying to weave through my talk, and how real that is. As a harm reduction person with other drugs, the beauty of the vaping is it is much like the experience people have with smoking. So that you know, the closer you can get to what people are used to, the more likely people will transition. So these other, I think, as far as a choice is super important, but the idea that people can transition quicker from smoking to vaping, or maybe even heat not burn, would be even in between there. That's more like what they're used to, I think, is the beauty of what we can offer for substitutes for cigarette smoking, as opposed to, you know, for years and still, you know, all I have for people who want to reduce their opioid use is methadone, which is a far cry from the experience people are getting from their heroin or their fentanyl now. So so that's taken me to what we're doing now for other drugs. For opioids, we're actually giving people pharmaceutical opioids, because it's better than the fentanyl people are buying on the streets. It's much safer for them, but it gives them a similar experience than they would from the illegal market. And then you can start, you know, working down to methadone. But often we have our harm reduction ideas upside down. Like, we start from something that's nowhere near like what people are experiencing, such as a nicotine patch. And then if that doesn't work, then we kind of work up. But we should be doing it totally the opposite. The best thing that is for you right now is a substitute or a transition that's much like the experience you're getting right now with cigarettes. And then we start moving back if that's what people want. But I think that's a general principle of harm reduction, to meet people where they're at and try to offer an experience that's much the same. And vape, you know, I'm not a vapor myself, but I've talked to a lot of people that are, and for a lot of people, the experience with vaping is superior to cigarette smoking because of flavors and the nicotine concentrations that they can select, and just the convenience of it. So that, I mean, you know, it's really from a public health point of view, you could not have devised anything better as far as following the harm reduction principles than vaping. So
I think we might start Q&A part. So if anyone would like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. Marua, yeah, I'm gonna give the voice to you. Just one information for those who are watching us online. You can also place your questions in the Q&A area. So Marua.
Thank you. Thank you for that great talk, Mark. Both Marks. Mark too. No. I'm Mārewa Glover from New Zealand. I've worked in tobacco control for 30 years, and I just wanted to reflect on and maybe give you some insight into the development initially of these very stigmatizing, shaming campaigns. So in the 1990s, you know, we would go to politicians and try and get more funding for tobacco control and our anti-smoking ideas. But there was lacking support in the public because people cared for their loved ones and friends who smoked. They understood why they smoked. So it was hard to get public support. So what we had to do, and these campaigns initially, of course it was said that they were aimed at people to develop, to increase their cognitive dissonance, and then the more that they would feel uncomfortable with and feel shame about smoking, then they would quit. But they were actually designed to incite hatred towards people who smoke, to destroy the compassion that people felt for people who smoke. And having achieved that, having succeeded very, very well at inciting hatred towards people who smoke, we can now do anything we want to them. We can remove the nicotine from combustible tobacco. We can fine them. We can imprison them. We can give death sentences. We can do anything we want. The public does not care. Not that they don't care. They want us to hurt them. They have no compassion. Don't give them vaping. Don't let them have access to something that will help them stop smoking. They deserve to die. This is the way people in tobacco control talk at their conferences, in their papers. And they want the public to do this. And someone was telling me a story, about Hitler and the Jews. This is the same strategy. So those campaigns were not aimed, that's why they don't work, because they were not aimed at people who smoke. They were aimed at everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Marua. Any comment?
Well, I think that's really interesting about the rejection of being told what to do, because I know I'm certainly one of those people. And my father used to smoke, and the day that he smokes every year is National No Smoking Day. It's interesting about the Jews and the Nazis, because the people there's a level of compliance there, and obviously the smokers aren't compliant people. So no, it's deeply worrying. I want to attend one of those conferences where they're like that. I would really like to, be a shit disturber there.
Thanks. Some more questions and comments? Oh yeah, I can see. So first, sorry, I need to stand up because I'm blinded by the light. So the lady there, and then Will, I think I see.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Pindile. I'm from South Africa. And the research that I did in 3 drug-resistant TB hospitals resonate well with the presence of stigma. It was so difficult for me to get smokers to participate in the study. At first, they thought maybe I'm from the government, and I'll identify them, then they will not have access to TB medication anymore, because they knew that smoking is not allowed. So I ended up using the snowballing technique, where, I would privately speak to smokers, and they would see that I'm not from the government, I'm not from the police, and they were happy to let me speak to their friends that smoke. And the stigma they faced in hospital was so bad that they had to, hide sometimes when they smoke. So what I want to say is, while we have policies on tobacco control, they should be accompanied with support. And patients felt that if they can't smoke, they need something to replace smoking with, because they have addictions, so there's that craving for cigarette that they really can't do anything about until they get something to smoke. So it was really amazing to see how much it affects them. I've never been a smoker, so others had to ask me if I've ever smoked. And they were thinking that, it's people like yourself, like me, who do not understand how we feel about it. And others were happy with smoking as a coping strategy for various reasons. So what I would like to propose, as we are all gathered here as different professionals, is that in order to show harm reduction, tobacco harm reduction in the products that are being invented every day, could harm reduction also be part of interventions where there's an opportunity to reduce smoking or to reduce harm? For instance, patients who are admitted because of TB infection, those with respiratory diseases, those with chronic diseases, there could be intervention programs for them. And any other institutions and organizations involved in tobacco harm reduction could be part of that as evidence, because when it comes to politicians and other professionals, the war against harm reduction, they say it's because there is no evidence. So to them, it's still getting people to smoke in a different way. So in order to show evidence, could the campaign on tobacco harm reduction also feature in interventions, within sectors like hospitals where inpatients could be followed up? I've seen a number of studies where they do cotinine testing and get into other means of supporting patients, although it's not sustainable, to be quite honest. And I'm happy with the question on equity that came up. As we get involved in tobacco harm reduction, there is quite vast population in developing countries that is being left behind, and truly that they cannot afford the products. So maybe that could be considered in the future. How could they have access? Because to be quite honest, our government are burdened with so many other issues: health, socioeconomic circumstances, and say violence, crime. So when it comes to budgeting, it becomes next to impossible to be, accommodating all other health promotion, harm reduction initiatives. And so I hope that in the future there could be consideration on making sure that even those from low socioeconomic backgrounds could access harm reduction initiatives and products, information, even in their own languages as well. But the specific one is they need practical assistance to stop smoking or to reduce smoking. And if it's too expensive for them, they tend to resort to more dangerous means of sustaining the craving. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that the theme of this session makes us just prone to share us with our statements and comments more than asking questions. So let me, because I can see there are plenty of hands. I think I've promised it to Will.
Hi, Will Godfrey, Filter Magazine. Despite the very clear parallels between tobacco harm reduction and other areas of drug policy reform and harm reduction, which Mark Tyndall has just outlined so excellently, it seems to me in covering the North American movements that engagement with THR from these movements is somewhat limited, with the exception of some powerful voices like Mark, like Ethan Nadelman and some others. It's sometimes lukewarm, and indeed we even sometimes hear examples of hostility, such as syringe access programs with anti-vaping policies. So my question for Mark Tyndall is, how receptive do you find your colleagues in drug harm reduction to tobacco harm reduction? And do you think that there are good prospects for improving integration of THR into wider harm reduction?
Yeah, that's a great question. You might see the brick marks on my head from banging my head against the wall repeatedly with my colleagues who, fully are on point with just the basic stuff of supervised injection sites and needle exchanges. Is just so obvious. But yeah, they draw the line at tobacco harm reduction. They are not generally supportive. I can't understand really why. I think what was talked about earlier, just the deep stigma and the fact that people should just quit cigarettes. Like they don't really see the need for harm reduction because it's just so obvious that people should just stop smoking cigarettes. And so it is very frustrating. And I am, often on my own in group meetings around harm reduction when I've said, we can't, everybody who comes into hospital should be offered vaping product, and they should be able to use them in the hospital. Like I think the UK has some programs like that, but Canada is so far away from that. And people who, and the other, so in answer to your question, it hasn't happened, and I haven't been made much progress with most of my colleagues. And the fascinating thing is that this is, people will die of their smoking, and the other harm reduction stuff we're doing is saving them from their HIV and their drug related things. But we're quite happy to watch people just chain smoke themselves to death, and it's very frustrating.
Thank you. It's really hard to pick. Could you please, as well, say your name and where are you from? That would be helpful, because at least I'm still learning.
Hi, I'm Bengt Wiberg from Sweden. I'd like to make a remark to Mark here. In 1.5 years ago, the European Tobacco Harm Reduction Advocates made the biggest nicotine survey so far, I think, in the world. We had 35,000 respondents from EU nations, whereas those several thousands of them were smokers. And when asked and 60% of those smokers said they wish they could quit smoking. 30% of those said we would be willing to try snus if it was available. I just had a revelation last night. I was watching the Swedish foreign minister on Polish TV saying that, of course, Sweden will accept Moldavia and Ukraine as EU candidates. That is very fine with me. But looking back, you probably all heard that Sweden and Finland is asking to join NATO. So why are we not members of NATO? Because Turkey has a veto right. Turkey wants something. So here's where we're going. If Sweden, to make a decision in EU, for example, to allow Swedish snus, Sweden vetoes a decision which is important for EU. We could then do like Turkey. Please allow snus. We have the lowest smoking prevalence in the European Union, and we have the lowest frequency of all tobacco-related cancer disease. So, Mark, can you remark? What do you think about the idea?
Well, from a real politic perspective, I don't know that Sweden would be gaining much out of it, because they're trying to help other people, and we all know governments tend to act in the self-interest to themselves to try and get re-elected rather than improve other people's health. But I just want to pick on the point you made about the survey. 30% of the people that wanted to quit smoking would try Swedish snus on the ETHRA survey. And I think that's really important because in the UK that translates to there's about 50% of people who smoke in the UK want to quit smoking, and then 30% of them, it's around 1.2 million. So there's a real opportunity there for something different, because I don't think vaping can carry the can all by itself, and I really enjoy vaping. But Mark Tyndall, I want to say, is absolutely correct. As a smoking cessation tool, it's far closer. But then I think we're missing out a huge chunk of people that would otherwise be interested. And I've done the calculations. If you had 1.2 million people interested in snus or nicotine pouches, the big problem we have in the UK with heat not burn is because it contains tobacco, you can't advertise it. So no one knows heat not burn exists. I think there's probably only about 50, 60,000 people using it in the UK. But if you look at Japan, whereby it's much more virulent, you've got millions of people using it. And I reckon if more people knew about heat not burn, because what it does do is it finds a type of person that doesn't like vaping, they prefer smoking, and heat-not-burn is closer to smoking. You probably get 1.5 million people using heat-not-burn. So we're already on 2.7 million people. And then finally, you've got 56% of smokers in the UK either think that vaping is as dangerous or they don't know whether it is. And there's a very convincing study that suggested for every 1%, that led to a 0.7% reduction in number of people vaping. So you're looking there at about 1.5 million people. So right off the bat, you've just hit, in one day's policy maneuvers by us all here today, you've hit like, what, 3.7 million people quitting? And I think the point is that it's not going to happen just by sitting on their hands. It actually takes policy changes and actions that the government needs to do. And frustratingly, they don't see that as a big win. But that leads me to ask the question, why do you get involved in politics if you don't want to actually improve the lot of man?
Thanks. So you sir, you wanted to ask a question? Yeah, and then you, sir, in red vest, I've noticed. I'm just trying to manage.
Hi, it's Andrew Manson from Helpful Consulting UK. I just wanted to put a question through, it's a question and a statement through to Mark. I mean, should we change the conversation a bit around, instead of quitting smoking, just understanding that consumers will continue to use nicotine in the same way that consumers will continue, people will continue to use alcohol, people will continue to use psychoactive drugs. And the acceptance of that around public health is what we need to establish. And once we establish that, then you can say, we need to offer safer alternatives. Because at the moment, the perception is, you know, people want to quit smoking, and it's the nicotine that keeps them smoking. Whereas there was a session yesterday, a very important session on the benefits of nicotine, and some people derive clear benefits from nicotine, and particularly those benefits are exacerbated with socioeconomic disparities, where nicotine helps many people to get through the day and get through life. We need to accept that, and then governments hopefully would be understanding that we need safer alternatives.
Mark?
Yeah, I think, I think that's a huge obstacle when we're still stuck with governments and many public health people saying that people should just quit using. And so we have not accepted that people will continue to use these substances. I mean, and we have, in some respects, in other drugs, accepted that, okay, people are going to continue to use these. We have to try and give them in a position that makes it a bit safer. But yeah, I think there's still a big barrier there for smoking, that smoking has no use for people. It's just an addictive substance, and they should just quit. And, you know, if you had to pick one thing in harm reduction for heroin users, the biggest harm reduction they have is smoking, I think, because people wake up in the morning and they don't have to rush out right away and get a fix. They smoke a couple cigarettes. I mean, it's a very useful thing for people, as is cannabis, as is other things that people rely on. So yeah, people, I do think that's a key point, that at this point, most people believe that nicotine has no benefit, that people are just doing it to stop them from craving more, and they should just stop. So yeah, we need to establish that it's an important thing for people to have. It's their right to have it, and we need to make it as safe as we can for them.
Thank you. Yeah, I've promised. The mic.
Hi, this is John from the UK. When I'm not vaping and doing all the other strange things I do, I'm a health services volunteer, and I've been working in hospitals prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic, looking after all sorts of different people, and I wanted to pick up on something that one of the earlier commenters picked up on, the harm reduction opportunities in hospitals and prompt interventions. And we are very lucky in the UK that there are a lot of hospitals that do have positive policies around the use of electronic cigarettes, even to the point in some cases of having stores. However, one of the prompt interventions that I made, there was a lady who was incredibly ill with an IV stand outside the hospital, smoking away, and I was there vaping, and started having the conversation with her about, maybe you try something else. There are these things, and she started to engage, and she was asking questions, and I said, I've got a spare one, you can have it. Just at the point that she was going to say yes, scream from the stage left, "You can't do that here!" Can't do what? Vape. Why not? Oh, it's like smoking. Yeah, but your hospital has a policy that this is okay. I don't care. And with that, the opportunity was gone. And my question is, okay, so we're talking to politicians about stuff, but Mark, the rest of the panel, how do we change the public perception? Because if anything else, you can run as many poster campaigns as you like, to try and ban vaping, but there's the problem. It's the hatred. It's not just stigma, it's hatred. How do we change that note?
Yeah, well, I think we're unpacking years and years of propaganda, and actually it's quite stark. I don't think, obviously, illegal drug use is not particularly popular, but I don't think it actually carries the same amount of hatred that tobacco does. And time and time again, you hear stories of people switching to vaping, and then they say, oh, my family told me not to do it because we don't know what's in it. And it's weird because when I smoked, I don't remember anyone coming up to me and saying, oh, you shouldn't smoke. That was obvious. But the amount of times, if I got some snus or vape, the amount of times someone's made a comment on it. So, yeah, you're actually right. And there's a big disconnect, actually. And the Britain is doing well. But if I'm honest, Britain's fairly top of a leaderboard, but only because everyone else is doing so awfully bad. And I speak to doctors as much as I can. It's not necessarily my field, but through friends, and there's a huge disconnect between the NICE guidelines, which is very supportive, and Javid Khan in his review pointed to that, and actually what doctors understand, even on things such as nicotine risk. What do we do? Well, really it's the role of the government. They should be pushing more information out to doctors, and I think the amount of education people get in medical school is very small, but even then, it takes years and years for that build into the doctors' population. So, is there a role for others? Absolutely. I think UK VIA are doing some work on trying to educate doctors. I know Dr. Sud's doing a magnificent job. But yeah, I mean, maybe when we go to our dinner parties, we need to be a bit more confident about nicotine, and doctors can be wrong.
Mark Tyndall, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I think that's a kind of a lost cause, trying to get doctors to get on. It's really got to be a groundswell of people who have an interest in this, and to push policy and make it happen. Do medical, one of the Australian idea that, they may allow nicotine if it's prescribed by your doctor or some crazy thing like that. Meanwhile, they're selling cigarettes at the corner store. I mean, if we try and go the medicalized route of this, I think we're missing the boat. The only reason cigarettes are medicalized is because they cause all this disease, but it's not really a medical product. People who smoke don't consider themselves having a disease necessarily. And so I think the change has to happen, like we're trying to do with grassroots organizations and people demanding their rights, and people going that route rather than trying to medicalize it. I mean, both have to try and happen, but if that was the strategy, let's let the medical system fix this for us. No, it's not going to happen. And being you know, being a physician for so many years, I mean, even I would, you know, if you ask people, everybody, if they smoke or not, you just put a checkbox in their chart if they do. You might mention, have you ever tried a nicotine patch? And they'll say, oh yeah, I've tried that, didn't work. And then you just go on to the next question. I mean, so it's doctors don't really have any real interest in it. It's ironic to me that some of the most vocal critics of vaping are like respirologists. We wouldn't need you respirologists if there wasn't smoking. I mean, they you know, they should be the ones that are going, this is obvious, we need to reduce the risk of cigarettes, because all my work is around people who smoke, and they seem not to be the people like that are pushing for safer products. So it really is not you know, something that's going to happen anytime soon through the medical profession. I think it's really got to happen through you know, people demanding their rights and people really pointing out the fact that this is a safer thing to do for people. I just want to make one question too about like a scale up of things, and that's one of the, although I said up front that I think we need to work with industry to do this. If we wanted to go to like you know, poorer countries, and the person from South Africa was talking about, you know, that how is it ever going to happen with commercial vaping products or commercial heat not burn products? I mean, it is never going to, you know, be affordable for people who can, you know, buy a cigarette for 2 cents or something. Then it's got to be like a sort of a global effort to get access to people. So they need to have, you know, no patents, no commercial, just like we did with antiretroviral drugs. If you really want to get them out there, these drugs that are in, you know, North America are $30,000 a year. You get them for $300 a year, and you have factories built that produce these safer technologies and allow people to access.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rafi Castillo from the Philippines. Thank you, Mark, for the very insightful talk. And it made me reflect on the question, is the social stigma on smokers a good thing, or is it a bad thing, or is it a good, you know, is it a good thing in some respect? Well, definitely it's bad if it causes low self-esteem in the smoker and it throws them into the pit of depression, and, you know, makes them shut down to all offers of help, harm reduction, for example. But to some degree, it can be a positive thing, because it can be a compassionate rebuke, which will motivate them to really consider smoking cessation and things like harm reduction. I think it's all a matter of mindset or perception of the public, particularly of the healthcare professionals, as pointed out earlier. Because if we look at the smokers as a social deviant, you know, a social norm deviant, who unknowingly causes harm on themselves, not only on themselves, but also on other people, then definitely the social stigma will be very negative, and it can be exaggerated or magnified. But if you look at the smoker, particularly recalcitrant smokers, as actually patients, and that personally I would consider smoking as an addiction, a behavioral disease. And recalcitrant smokers need all the compassionate care that we, particularly healthcare professionals, can possibly give them. Then I think the social stigma will be different. And it will be a positive motivational factor. I must confess, I humbly confess that I fell into this trap. I think yesterday, or was it the other day, I shared that in our clinic we used to have a very harsh policy against recalcitrant smokers. We gave them 6 months to quit smoking. We gave them all the support that we could give them in the clinic. And if they don't quit, we don't give them an appointment anymore. We we courteously refer them to other clinics, and our attitude is good riddance. But we reconsidered this over the last couple of years, and just with a change of mindset, our strategies, our approach towards recalcitrant smokers, it really changed completely. So we're now more compassionate, we're now more tolerant. We offered them more options at helping them quit smoking, or at the very least mitigate their harm, their health risk, and also mitigate the risk that they're offering the public, as in secondhand smoking. So that's where we really have to, I think, reflect also on the question, how much social stigma is healthy for the smokers, something that is positive to motivate them to quit smoking or to consider at the very least harm reduction, and how much social stigma would be negative that can lead to negative long-term mental and physical outcomes. Just a thought, and I would love to hear your additional comments on that. Thank you very much.
Which one of you?
I mean, if I'm hearing you right, I mean, I think there's very little room or very little positivity for social stigma. I think that with drugs or addictions, people are using them to self-medicate, and if they're feeling bad about themselves, they'll continue to self-medicate. I mean, that people stop smoking, and in my experience, when they get an epiphany and they decide that they want to make a change, they want to stop, and usually when it's on a positive note. When people are feeling terrible about themselves and feeling so stigmatized and isolated, it's not a motivation at all. It's a motivation to keep smoking more, because that's what they're self-medicating for. So I see hardly any room for a non-compassionate and a non-helpful way if we're really trying to help people to stop smoking. And making people feel worse about themselves is one of the reasons why they're doing it in the first place. So it makes no sense to me to shame and stigmatize people. It won't make them change.
Thank you. I think we have room for one, maybe two more questions.
Hi, Mark. It's John Oyston here from Toronto. I'm a little disappointed that as a fellow physician, you've maybe given up on the medical profession. And I accept that physicians aren't going to take the lead on this, but surely we need at least to educate physicians enough so that when their patients switch to vaping, they say, oh, that's a good thing, congratulations. And also for those people who do choose to go to medical smoking cessation clinics, then those clinics should be offering vaping and snus and other alternatives. I think we have to move at least that far with physicians, don't you think?
Oh yeah, definitely. So I kind of went a little too far. I really meant the leadership. Like, if this is what we're going, how we're going to make a major transition, to leave it up to doctors, I think is not going to happen. So, but certainly, the work that you do so well with physician groups is super important, and doctors can have a real negative impact on this if they remain steadfast in their opposition to vaping. So it's clearly we need to get them on side, and colleagues of mine that I know in smoking cessation clinics who are still not even suggesting alternative nicotine products. I'm just it's terrible, costing people they're costing lives. So definitely the education is very important. But my comment was more referring to, if we want to make this happen in a quick, scalable fashion, then we can't rely on doctors to do it.
Okay, one quick question. One quick question we can accommodate, and one, if not, so I'm still blinded, so I don't see if anyone wants to. Okay, so we have 2 minutes for your final comments and thoughts, if you are happy to share some additional remarks. Okay, Mark Tyndall.
I wish I was there so I could talk to people face to face, but you know, I'm very committed to you know, to pushing this ahead, and I think that you know, we really need to recognize that that people have the right to nicotine. It's useful for a lot of people. We'll continue to use it, and that we need to offer people a variety of options to get this done. And it's you know, we're all in the room talking to each other that pretty much are on the same side, but we're unfortunately a small voice in this, and there's a huge push. You know, things are getting worse. Like, you know, these GFN conferences have been going on, and I mean, I think we were more optimistic 2 years ago. You know, we didn't expect countries to like announce like total bans, and the WHO not to make any movement and be so obstructive and damaging. So the work's cut out for us for sure, and you know, it's got to keep pushing on and climb that ladder, I think, so.
Thanks. So I would like to, I think we might, it's 1:15, and the voice in my ear says we should end. So thank you very much for joining us today, and a coffee break, yeah? This is what waits for us. Thank you.
Thanks.